Now, I don't usually do reviews for series, I usually do scaling and theories, etc. But I want to know your thoughts on Dragon Ball Daima. Can you put your rating for Dragon Ball Daima and the reason why, or your main reason why, down in the comment section? I want to see what you think about this series. Now, hopefully, I'll give you quite a nuanced answer to my thoughts on this series in this video. I'm not somebody who sees this as binary, it's either great or it's trash. I think there's a lot of in between. Obviously, as an older fan, I'm coming from the perspective of how do I rate this alongside other arcs or stories within the Dragon Ball franchise, as well as other anime. But what I want to say in this video is, did it live up to expectations? Were my expectations actually reasonable, or were they misled? And I'll be honest about it, I think they were. I think the objective of this series didn't align with what I thought it was capable of, and they may have achieved their objective, whereas rating this series in isolation or in a vacuum is a different matter, and I'll do that in this video. So I'll rate it in a vacuum and also rate it as if it's going to have some retroactive importance in a future story. So, it's been a week since the conclusion of Dragon Ball Daima, after episode 20 wrapped up the story for the Dragon Ball Daima story, and you're probably wondering, well, why haven't you covered this earlier, more recently after the episode finished? Well, the truth is I was furious after watching episode 20. I'd basically gone Super Saiyan rage, but ultimately, after a week has passed, calmed down a little bit. I had a long week at work, I watched it after a long week at work, and it disappointed in terms of wrapping up the story threads that I was hoping that would be wrapped up and presenting something to be excited about in the future. Now, I'm not saying there's nothing to be excited about in the future. I'm hoping this review is a fair and balanced review, but ultimately I'm going to get into the nuts and bolts, the weeds of this story. And I have to say this, animation wise, this show is a 10 out of 10. If animation is what you care about, or animation quality, you have to watch this, especially if you're a Dragon Ball fan. It's the best animated Dragon Ball series of all time. It's better than the recent movies, it's fantastic. However, personally, from a personal standpoint, animation isn't my dig. Ultimately, I want an engrossing narrative that sees character arc growth from the main cast of characters and introduces new characters who also go through character arc growths, and I'll get into my thoughts on that in just a moment. But like I said, the animation, utterly fantastic. I'm not really including the animation so much when I'm bringing up a final rating for this series, simply because other potential routes that Dragon Ball could have gone was to, animate Dragon Ball Super, and I believe if the Moro arc had this animation team, it would look exquisite as well. I feel like it's more just a product of its time and the fact that it's got this team, whereas the Dragon Ball Super anime run didn't have this type of team or production. But moving forward, if they do that, then this franchise is going to look absolutely bloody wonderful. Like I said, I was furious after episode 20 of Dragon Ball Daima. In terms of wrapping up story threads, I don't think I liked a single story thread that was concluded, other than the fact that they obviously beat Goma. Now, I think a big elephant in the room for a lot of people is obviously the matter of Dragon Ball Super's manga continuation and how Daima aligns with that. Now, I'll say this, I don't mind if they want to create different timelines or different continuities, but I think a lot of us at least want Super, or at least some knowledge that Super's story post-Superhero is going to be wrapped up. If they want to go in a completely different direction from Super from now on, I'm okay with it. But I've invested a lot of time into that story and I want to see it wrapped up, and I actually think it was in a good place after chapter 103, after that sparring session on Beerus' planet, so I'd like to see that wrapped up. Now, I know that's not to do with Daima, and it shouldn't really reflect on Daima really, but I think that's giving us an impression of where the zeitgeist is with the Dragon Ball fandom currently. We don't know what the fuck is happening. Now, in terms of Daima's quality, like I said, I'll repeat this because I know people will try and come at me with it. The animation, 10 out of 10. I'm not somebody who bases what I watch off of animation alone. There's plenty of good series that are animated very well, but for Dragon Ball, this is the best so far. Hopefully, it continues in the future. Still, story-wise, this does not live up to Dragon Ball Z. Dragon Ball Renaissance, even with Super, none of it quite touches Dragon Ball Z. Even Dragon Ball Z's weaker arcs, some may argue whether that's Cell arc or the Buu arc, even though I think the Moro arc comes pretty close, Daima comes nowhere near it. That's not to say I hated absolutely everything about Daima. It introduced some new lore, as if you've been following me for a while, you'll know that's one of my favourite things. The Dragon Ball verse is one of my favourite verses in all of fiction. It's incredible. Toriyama is a genius, and it did add some interesting elements. To make a series out of that, probably not, unless it leads somewhere in the future, because it certainly didn't really lead anywhere in this particular story. The story was incredibly basic, very few layers to the story, in terms of subplot. And whilst I don't hate the new characters introduced, for example, Glorio, Pansy, they're alright. But am I that invested in their characters? Do I feel emotionally attached to their characters any kind of way? No. But that's what Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z did extremely well. You became emotionally invested in the characters. When Android 16 died, you erupted just like Gohan did. Nothing like that is happening in this series. In fact, it's been a problem for the Dragon Ball Renaissance overall, really. Even Super struggles with this. I think this is the final ingredient that Super is really struggling to imitate when it comes to matching Dragon Ball Z. And look, all of us, we just want Dragon Ball to be great again. And I know you'll get the Twitter kids or Twitter goons, like some of the worst Dragon Ball fans in existence, just glazing Dragon Ball Daima and just saying it's great. Look, I'm not talking to these little kids. I'm an older fan. I'm talking to those Dragon Ball fans in the 20s, the 30s. If you're a kid and you watch me, great. But ultimately, I'm talking to these older fans of the Dragon Ball franchise. People who remember when these series were actually released on the go, live, and remember how good they were, and remember what Dragon Ball was in its heyday. Once again, I like Super. It's been good, in my opinion, since the Future Trunks arc. It's not been great. Daima has some great moments, mostly hype moments to be honest, but it's watchable. I would definitely say watch it, especially if you're an animation fan. The fights are good, the villain's garbage, no character development really for any of the characters, and obviously it really puts the wider timeline into disarray, which I think has got a lot of people irked, to be honest, because we wanted to see how this could lead to something in the future of the Dragon Ball Super story. Some people are okay with it not being part of Dragon Ball Super, even though I think that's still up in the air. I did say I would die on this hill, and I was 99% sure only a few weeks ago. I can definitely say I'm not 99% sure now. However, it's still fixable. The main issues: Super Saiyan 4 Goku. He may have somehow had some magic left in him from Neva, that's why he could reattain the form as an adult. And I'm just really throwing random theories out here. Super Saiyan 3 Vegeta needs to be fixed, and obviously the Kibito Kai fusion needs to be fixed as well, because obviously it doesn't fit in line with Battle of Gods. But if they're going with a different continuity, a different timeline, and opening that up, I'm okay with it, because you know I'm a comics fan and I've always been okay with comics doing that. Sometimes they may converge these timelines and continuities for a one-off event. For example, Infinite Crisis in DC, I loved that. If they want to go that route and do that in Dragon Ball, brilliant. But even in its own right, Dragon Ball Daima, in my opinion, story-wise, is a disappointment. Whilst it does introduce some new lore, doesn't do too much with it. The villain, I'm all for having a good villain. The likes of Frieza and Zamasu are my favourite types of villains that have real agendas. Or even say Baby Vegeta in GT had an agenda, a legitimate agenda. Whilst his fixation on Goku was a bit weird, his fixation on the Saiyans was legitimate. He had a reason to go after them. Gohan was basically just a clown. Now I know they're trying to go off the sort of peel-off vibe, but it just doesn't really work. Unless this is setting up a story later, and I think it is, by the way. I think we're either going to get season 2 or a movie. If I had to put my money on it now, I do think we're getting another movie that is going to introduce a villain from the Demon Realm that is the real big baddie of the Demon Realm. After all, the end credit scene was them basically finding more third eyes, and the third eye was more powerful than Super Saiyan 4 Goku. As we saw at the end of that fight, Gohan was actually powering up again before Majin Buu actually knocked the eye out of his head. I weren't particularly that pleased with that type of ending either. Now to sum it up, I loved the actual first episode of this series. It was 30 minutes. They should have made the finale 30 minutes and kept the intro as 20 minutes. I don't know why they did that, just a bizarre decision. But right up until say episode 17, this series was really lackluster once again. Not including the animation. The animation was utterly fantastic. But even though people like those battles against the Tamagamis and the Saiyans, and yeah, they were good fights to watch, once again, there wasn't really that much emotional involvement. The intensity and tension wasn't really there. We knew that Goku and Vegeta were just going to mock them over anyway. Daima is suffering the same issue that Super had, that the stakes just aren't there. They really need to go past the end of Z with any future stories, because we know they survive. We know they're alright in the end, and it needs to go past this. Ultimately, there was no tension in those fights, no emotional investment in those fights, and even in the final fight, there's a tiny bit of emotional investment, but we know Goku's going to win. We don't care about any characters that are potentially on the edge of death. There are no deaths. It's just stakeless again. But I think as a fan that's been reading the guidebooks and researching the Demon Realm for a long time and theorizing about what the Demon Realm could become, even though I like the free Demon World concept, the demons were quite disappointing. I definitely expected more. In fact, I think even the concepts in Heroes about the demons were better. But I'll repeat, the animation and the fight choreography, utterly amazing. If they can do this for the Moro arc, in fact, I'm actually going to say this, if they can do that for the Granola arc, those arcs are going to be fire animated. But still, even well choreographed, well animated fights need that story tension to actually elevate it. The best thing to happen in Dragon Ball period, in my opinion, is Gohan vs Cell when he turns Super Saiyan 2, because it has every ingredient you need to maximize tension. Goku vs Frieza on Namek did it as well, to be fair. But for me, that Gohan moment, because we'd seen him grow up, we'd seen his character development, it all led to that moment. In Daima, there's nothing that leads to any of these moments happening. It's just an event that's taking place. Does that mean it's not watchable? Once again, no, make sure you watch it. The animation's incredible. It does have some lore that hopefully will have a part to play in the future of the series. So there's definitely worthwhile parts. But ultimately, I think because it's Toriyama's last series, or potential last series, I know people are saying that he wrote a movie as well, I think maybe my expectations were probably too high. I was expecting some grand finale that wrapped up a lot of story threads and added some incredible new lore details, and basically retroactively even enhanced Super in time to come. However, I do agree that this story is possibly continuing. They are still in the demon realm after all, and they've just found more third eyes. Who do those third eyes belong to? Who was the originator of those third eyes? There's clearly something about the demon realm that's even more powerful than what we've seen in terms of Goma, because Goma just wasn't that serious. Now I will say, Daima is better than Heroes, but that concept, in fact Heroes does a lot of concepts that are quite interesting, but weren't really delivered to any degree. But ultimately, I just thought there was some things that I expected to be better and they weren't better. Now, Ioku did say that this series was aimed at kids, and that's why they went for the adventure route, which I don't mind. I didn't hate that, but ultimately, it's not for me. It's not one of the older fans. But he also did say it was for the GT fans, and that is kind of my era. I was watching GT on Cartoon Network a long time ago, and if I'm honest, whilst Daima is definitely better than the first 19-20 episodes of GT, because they were truly and utterly trash, except for the Legic and General Rildo fights, if you bring the baby arc into it and add it on top, then that arc from GT is better. Of course, Super Android 17 comes next, and that's even worse. But this is what I'm saying, if you start looking at it in comparison to other parts of the Dragon Ball franchise, it doesn't actually hold up that well if you remove the animation from it. If you gave this animation to those arcs and modernized them, then those arcs would look great as well. Now just to add some balance into it, I do actually prefer Daima's Super Saiyan 4 design to GT's Super Saiyan 4 design, and I don't hate GT's Super Saiyan 4 design. I wish they would have given it a different name other than Super Saiyan 4, but that's not happened. It's called Super Saiyan 4 as well. But there was literally no foreshadowing of this form coming, even though I knew this form was coming. I've known it's been coming since before the series started. There was no foreshadowing or hints that this form was coming throughout the entire damn thing. In terms of adding interesting narrative points or plot devices, this series just seems like a catalogue of missed opportune moments. I would actually even say that most of the GT fans that were watching back in the day are probably still watching and following Dragon Ball Super anyway. It's trying to introduce it to a new audience. I can understand and I can forgive that. I want Dragon Ball to be seen by everyone. I want it to be great again. So I can understand if that's the series' objective, then it wouldn't really have appealed to me, at least story-wise, where I want it to grow up. It's kind of grown down again. But if that was its objective, then it probably has succeeded in its objective. So if I rank it like that, then sure, it's getting way higher than a 4 out of 10. But if I was to rank it in a vacuum, then the story, as that's my main interest in these things, then it just wasn't that good. It didn't live up to other arcs of Dragon Ball, certainly not Z. In fact, it wasn't even as good as many arcs in Super. I said after episode 15 that it wasn't even as good as Resurrection of F. I do think it may have surpassed that with the 3 episodes of 17, 18 and 19, but it's not surpassed it by much. In fact, I remember everybody thinking that Resurrection of F was great at the time when it came out. In fact, a lot of things that happened in Resurrection of F actually impacted what happened further down the line with the story, especially with Frieza. Ultra Instinct was even foreshadowed in Resurrection of F. So I argue, whilst I think Resurrection of F is a really poor arc and is the worst in Dragon Ball Super, that retroactively it actually has been improved because of its impact later down the road. Can that happen with Daima? Well, I would imagine so, because I believe there's some sort of continuation coming out of this, whether it be a new series or a new season or a movie, so I guess we'll have to wait and see. But in a vacuum, for me, it's a 4 out of 10. It just isn't that good if you take animation away from it. Anyway guys, let me know what you think down in the comment section. I look forward to reading what you've got to say. They're my honest final thoughts on Dragon Ball Daima. I want Dragon Ball to be great again. If it's leading to something better, sure, but I admit I'm taking copium with that. If it isn't, then that was a disappointing story and a disappointing entry for the Demon Realm. Drop your thoughts, smash a like on the video. Until next time, ad Astra.